Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising. This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Saunderson, and in the early hours of Monday the 24th of October, these are our main stories. China's Xi Jinping secures an unprecedented third five-year term as president and gives his close allies top jobs. Boris Johnson rules himself out of the race to become Britain's next Prime Minister. As Russia continues to target key infrastructure in Ukraine, we hear from the Nobel Peace Prize winner trying to get justice for thousands of torture victims.
They told me how they were beaten, how they were raped, how their fingers were cut, how they were smashed into wooden boxes, tortured with electricity, etc., etc.
Also in this podcast, reports of a massive crackdown on civilians and mistreatment of women and girls by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And
if there is very stereotypical French music playing in a supermarket aisle, I haven't noticed that it's influencing me, but off I go with my nice bottle of French Plomb.
We hear about the incredible power of music on the mind. President Xi has cemented his position as China's most powerful leader in decades after announcing at the end of the week-long Communist Party Congress that he's secured his position for a third five-year term. It underlines his success in spearheading the abolition of presidential term limits on leaders, paving the way for him to become leader for life. Appearing in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, Xi Jinping highlighted how his leadership had brought prosperity to all Chinese people and made the country a global big hitter.
Just as China cannot develop in isolation from the world needs China for its development. Through over 40 years of relentless reform and opening up, we have created the twin miracles of fast economic growth and long-term social stability.
The president also revealed the lineup of China's most powerful political body, the Politburo Standing Committee, purging key rivals and appointing 6 loyalists, all men. I asked our East Asia editor Michael Bristow whether his grip on the country is complete.
It certainly looks very much that way. Previous leaders over the last few decades have retired after 2 5-year terms. He's not done that. He's extended that for another 5 years, and who knows, perhaps until he dies. There's very little authority in China which can now remove him from power. He's also elevated some of his very closest friends and loyalists, people who've been with him and he's known for several decades, to the very top of the Chinese Communist Party, the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Those people are now surrounding him. Other people who were in the Politburo Standing Committee previously have been ejected also. Those people who perhaps had slightly different opinions to Xi Jinping. So it certainly looks like he really has solidified his power over the whole of China, really.
So what does this all tell us, do you think, about the future direction of China and in particular its attitude towards Taiwan?
Well, what we've had thus far is Xi Jinping has laid out the kind of areas which he feels are important. And the main one is what he calls the great rejuvenation of China. He doesn't always explain fully what it means, but it means essentially China becoming more powerful, stronger, richer, and asserting itself on the world stage. And that has implications, as you just mentioned there, for Taiwan. Taiwan is an island which China considers its own territory. It wants to unify with the island. And in the constitution, which was changed on Saturday in China, that constitution essentially okays the use of force. And this is what Victor Gao had to say. Now, he's a spokesman sometimes for the Chinese Communist Party.
If, for example, the separatists in Taiwan want to push the situation beyond the point of no return by declaring independence, or foreign countries want to aid and abet separatism in Taiwan, then China will have no other option but to use force.
Other areas I think are going to be important is increased security, the power of the Communist Party to control all aspects of Chinese society, and perhaps less emphasis on the economy. I think it's security and the power of the party which are going to be the main themes of the next 5 years.
Michael Bristow. Less than 7 weeks after he was forced to resign as Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has abandoned his bid to return to power. Mr Johnson had cut short his Caribbean holiday to launch a campaign to take over from Liz Truss, who replaced him and was herself forced to resign last week after just 44 days in office. Now Mr Johnson has ruled himself out of the race to replace her, leaving the field to former Finance Minister Rishi Sunak and prominent Brexiteer Penny Mordaunt. Our political correspondent Rob Watson told me what lay behind Mr Johnson's decision.
Well, he's certainly not pulling out because of any lack of desire or self-belief, that's for sure, Val. I think he's pulling out because he's just worried that he won't get enough support from Conservative MPs, even though he thinks that he's still strong enough amongst party activists. But it has to be said that his withdrawal statement has to be one of the least gracious, most poisonous and incendiary that one has seen in recent times, because effectively he blames his withdrawal on the refusal, as he sees it, of the two remaining candidates, Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt, to unite behind him, to work together with him in the national interest. So a pretty explosive departure.
So, Rob, does it look as if the former Finance Minister Rishi Sunak is on course to become the new Prime Minister?
Well, given everything that's happened in British politics over the last few weeks and months, Val, you'd forgive me for being a little bit cautious. I mean, he's certainly the bookmakers' favourite. The one hope that Penny Mordaunt, the other remaining candidate, might have is if, let's say, supporters of Boris Johnson switch to her. So I think there's absolutely an element of doubt. This is not a kind of coronation yet, but absolutely Rishi Sunak at this point, as we speak, is the favourite.
And it might be settled at pretty much warp speed.
Oh, it could be, because the hasty new rules that they set up when Liz Truss departed were that would be you need 100 Conservative MPs to back you to count as a leadership candidate, and it may be that only Rishi Sunak gets that, in which case it's all over at 2 p.m. London time. But I think the most important point here, and it's, if you like, it's been emphasised by the manner and style of Boris Johnson's defeat, is that whoever wins, whether tomorrow or on Friday, which is when the contest has to end, is going to face a nightmare task. But because it's quite clear the Conservative Party is not united around any particular leader, whoever wins. And secondly, it's not united around any agreed vision of what sort of post-Brexit Britain should look like, following the sort of death, if you like, of the sort of Singapore-on-Thames version, which sort of blew up with the premiership of Liz Truss.
And of course, huge problems, a cost of living crisis, a war in Ukraine, an awful lot to sort out.
Yes, I mean, let's say you were taking over a very divided, very fractious party, which is just running with bad blood. I mean, I can't emphasise that enough. After 12 years in power on all these ructions, these 357 Conservative MPs, I mean, there just is so much bad feeling and vengeance. That would sort of be difficult enough if it was against this immensely kind of rosy, growing economy, low inflation, sort of peace around the world. But as you say, it's absolutely not that. I mean, these could not be more difficult times. Of all the G7 countries, of the rich countries, the UK seems to be facing the most difficult of all the challenges, and in the midst of a sort of running political crisis.
Rob Watson. Parts of the Ukrainian capital and nearby regions have suffered power blackouts in the last few hours because of the recent Russian airstrikes on electricity infrastructure. Ukraine's electricity operator says they're working around the clock to fix the damage and have restored supplies in some areas. Ukraine's defence minister, Alexei Reznikov, said the attacks were a fresh tactic by Russia's new commander in Ukraine.
It's a new tactics of the new commander of Russian armed forces. He used the same tactics in Syria, and this is tactics to fight with the civilians, not with the armed forces of Ukraine. That's why we absolutely comprehended that priority number one is air defense systems for Ukraine.
Throughout the day, Russia has also been on a diplomatic offensive. The Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has been having conversations with his Western counterparts. So, how significant is this? Our Europe regional editor is Danny Eberhard.
It's very unusual. Now, clearly the main purpose of this was for Mr. Shoigu to push a message that Russia feared that Ukraine might use a so-called dirty bomb. Dirty bombs are things that have radioactive material in them, but they don't have an atomic blast as such. Now, Ukraine has rejected this completely. President Zelensky and one of his advisors said that this is a lie, and they see it basically as part of a Russian disinformation campaign. We've heard from the defence ministers in France and the UK who said that the calls were initiated by the Russian side. And remember, Val, that for a long time, defence ministers from allies of Ukraine were not speaking with the defence minister from Russia. There was no contact at all until Friday, really, when Mr. Shoigu put in a call to the defence secretary in the US. The timing is unusual. What it heralds, we can't say for sure, but certainly Ukraine is pouring cold water on the claim, and it fears that Moscow could be the ones that would use such a weapon in the conflict.
And Ukraine's security service has detained one of the country's richest men, hasn't it, accused of helping the Russians?
Yeah, this is an intriguing story. They've arrested a man called Vyacheslav Boguslayev. He's someone who was awarded the Hero of Ukraine 2 decades ago. He is the honorary president of a major industrial supplier of aircraft engines and turbines. And what the allegations are from the Ukrainian security services is that his company or management at that company have been supplying engines and aircraft parts to Russia through intermediaries in the Middle East, Europe and East Asia. And this obviously is an incendiary allegation. They haven't put a time frame on when this happened, but they say it was done to break trade restrictions.
Danny Eberhard. Tens of thousands of allegations of war crimes have been recorded in Ukraine since the start of Russia's invasion. But how to investigate and prosecute all the cases? Well, it's a key challenge for all human rights activists in the country, including the Centre for Civil Liberties, one of the recipients of this year's Nobel Peace Prize. The volunteer-led organisation is headed by Alexandra Matvichuk. She hopes the award will help set up an international tribunal to prosecute top Russian officials involved in the conflict and to give a platform to victims. She's been speaking to the BBC's Hugo Bachega in Kyiv in her first international broadcast interview.
We're here at the scene of a recent Russian attack in central Kyiv, clearly a civilian site. When you look at things like this, how do you feel?
I feel that it's the additional episodes of war crimes which we have been documenting for 8 years and which largely increasing after the 24th of February, that we have 21,000 of episodes of war crimes which we jointly documented together with our partners throughout the country. And I ask myself a question: who will provide justice for the whole victims of these horrible war crimes? I work with horrible stories of people who survived from Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, how they were raped, how their fingers were cut, how they were smashed into wooden boxes, tortured with electricity, etc., etc. But even me wasn't prepared to such level of atrocities. I feel a huge responsibility.
How is it affecting you personally?
We are all human beings. Russians use war crimes as the methods of warfare. They try to break our resistance with inflicting the immense pain on civilian population. We document this pain. It's very difficult.
And it seems now that the Russians are trying to attack civilian infrastructure ahead of winter.
Yes, Putin tells that they intentionally destroy critical civilian infrastructure in order to deprive Ukrainians from electricity, water, heating, etc. But we will survive.
You say that weapons should be given to the Ukrainians.
In this war, we defend the freedom in all senses. And you can see what happened in Bucha. We found bodies of dead people in their yard, in the gardens of their own households. So, yes, Ukrainians need weapons to survive.
You say that if there's no justice now, this is going to happen again.
Yes, Russian troops committed war crimes for decades. in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Syria, in Mali, in Libya, and they enjoyed impunity. They believed they can do whatever they wanted. We must break the circle of impunity.
Alexandra Matvichuk. The BBC turned 100 years old this month. It started broadcasting way back in 1922 with a 1-minute weather and news bulletin as a public service information provider. Today it broadcasts across 24 hours in 42 different languages over the world. The brand has become synonymous with accuracy and integrity. One example was the Six-Day War between Israel and Arab countries in June of 1967, when the BBC was the only broadcaster reporting a correct turn of events at the time. This was our reporter Adrian Porter broadcasting from Tel Aviv.
The military spokesman, General Shalev, referred to attacks by Egyptian tanks trying to break through towards the canal and away from the axis of the Israeli advance. The information he gave about the battle suggested that the Israeli armoured columns had cut off some of the Egyptian tank units from their main vehicle-worthy passages to the west. He refused to say that Egyptian units were completely cut off from the canal zone, commenting with a smile, the Egyptians can still walk there.
There's no recording of the announcement on BBC Arabic, but it was the only radio station which told Arabs they'd lost the war, while all Arab stations celebrated victory. Maher Othman was an announcer on the BBC World Service Arabic service in 1967, and he took Julian Warwicker back in time to the Six-Day War that he was covering from London.
It was a period of humiliation, disaster, and a real awful shock to discover that Arab armies of Egypt, of Jordan, of Syria were so defeated so quickly in less than 6 days. And these countries lost huge chunks of land. So it was an awful period which gave us self-doubt.
Presumably, a lot of people listening to your BBC Arabic output at that point were clearly hoping for a different outcome, were horrified at what was really happening and didn't want to believe it. So how difficult was it for you to confront them with the truth?
It was difficult because I myself and Arab people who were on the staff of the BBC started doubting the neutrality of the BBC itself because of historical precedents. Things like the Balfour Declaration given to the Zionist movement, which gave Palestine to that movement. But then, in reality, when we thought about it deeply, we were convinced that the news was correct because we could see that the BBC itself is a corporation. It's not part of a government. It's not part of any political party. At the bottom of each news item that we translated or announced on radio had the initials or the name of the correspondent and the name of the news agency like Reuters, AFP, AP. The BBC had correspondents on the ground in many Arab capitals and in the area, and it had a monitoring service which monitored broadcasts from the area. They used to really scrutinize news items to make sure that they were correct.
Despite all that evidence, and it was pretty categorical evidence, yes, were you encountering quite a lot of resistance among some colleagues to actually put that on the air, even though by then you knew it was true?
We really thought of going on strike, and some of us even thought of resigning. But then our seniors, older generations, sort of calmed us and pacified us and said, look, this will be over soon, and you are young, don't be so hasty. We had no choice but to calm down.
As the dust began to settle on that Six-Day War and the consequences of it, how did you reflect on it?
The first thing that came to mind was not to believe anything you hear. The propaganda that was broadcast by radio stations like the Voice of the Arabs from Egypt was full of unreal things and promises that never came true. This massive defeat exposed the fallacy of this previous propaganda, the wrong type of journalism and rhetoric. And so, yeah, it made us have a look at a fresh look.
We're talking, because the BBC is 100 years old, when you look back at the time that you spent working for the BBC World Service, specifically in Bush House, the famous building where the World Service was based for so long, do you look back fondly at your time?
Absolutely. I think it was the happiest period of my life. And the reason is that the BBC Arabic service was listened to throughout the Arab world. It presented fantastic programs, cultural, literary, political, entertainment, all kinds of attractive programs. And we had fantastic scholars working alongside us and playwrights. These people presented fantastic programs, and the news and the current affairs were listened to in the Arab world by kings and presidents and ministers and anybody in politics, and by the ordinary people.
Maher Othman, former broadcaster at the BBC's Arabic service, and the BBC has now decided to stop its radio broadcasts in Arabic. Still to come. Lost and Found, a work by Black Canadian-American composer Nathaniel Dett. The UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Afghanistan, Richard Bennett, says that during his recent visit, people in the Panjshir region told him about a massive crackdown on civilians by the Taliban. He said residents in the northern part of the country briefed him on widespread human rights abuses, including the violation of women and girls. With more details, here's our South Asia editor, Anbarasan Ethirajan.
The UN official recently completed a 12-day visit to Afghanistan, meeting human rights defenders, women's groups and victims of abuse. Richard Bennett was given access to the Panjshir region, where an anti-Taliban alliance is carrying out a low-level insurgency. Mr. Bennett said during his visit he was also informed about the alleged ill-treatment of surrendered or injured fighters opposed to the Islamist group. There has been no response yet from the Taliban. He is submitting a report on the situation in Afghanistan to the UN General Assembly next week. The Taliban carried out widespread searches and arrests following attacks by the insurgents. Videos on social media showed alleged executions of captured insurgents by armed men. Soon after his visit, Mr. Bennett warned that Afghanistan continued to experience a serious crisis and urgent action was needed from all parties to avert a further deterioration of the situation.
Anbarasan Ethirajan. The deadly jihadist attack on a hotel in southern Somalia is now over. Police in the port city of Kismayo say all 3 gunmen have been killed. The firefights went on for hours. The number of confirmed deaths stands at 9, with 47 others wounded. Earlier I spoke to our Africa correspondent Emmanuel Igunza, who's been following the story from Nairobi.
The attack started when a suicide bomber rammed his explosive-laden car through the gates of this hotel, and then gunmen, from what we understand from witnesses, then stormed the hotel and started shooting randomly, and police have been, since the better part of the afternoon, trying to contain them. Quite a fluid situation ongoing as police try to restore calm and gain access to the hotel.
And Emmanuel, do we have any idea why this hotel in particular was targeted?
It's a very popular hotel in Kismayo, and many businessmen, government officials do hold their meetings there. Today was also very unique in that the local politicians and some of the local elders were holding a meeting to talk about how to tackle the Al-Shabaab militants who've been holding insurgency in Somalia for the last 15 years. So it was during this meeting that the attack happened. Al-Shabaab militants have been on the back foot in recent months because the government forces, also with support from local militia, clan militia, and also the African Union forces, have been putting a lot of pressure and have regained huge territories from Al-Shabaab. But that notwithstanding, the Al-Shabaab fighters have been carrying out attacks like this one in several parts of central and southern Somalia.
Emmanuel Igunza. Salman Rushdie's agent says the author has lost his sight in one eye and the use of one hand after the brutal attack he suffered 2 months ago in New York State. Mr. Rushdie had been living in fear after receiving a death fatwa from Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei in 1989 over his novel, The Satanic Verses. Sasha Schlichter reports.
The 75-year-old author was preparing to deliver a lecture in western New York State, not far from Lake Erie, when a young man mounted the stage and went on a frenzied stabbing attack. Salman Rushdie was rushed to hospital. Now, for the first time, his agent has spoken of the severity of his injuries. Andrew Wiley described his wounds as profound, with 3 of them being to the neck and 15 to his chest and torso. One hand is incapacitated because the nerves in his arm were cut. He also noted the loss of sight in one eye. He declined to say whether Rushdie was still in hospital.
Sasha Schlichter. We know music can take us back in time. It can be a direct path to memories in childhood. But music may have an even greater power and could, for example, influence whether you pick up a savoury snack or a sweet bar of chocolate in the supermarket. Turn It Up, The Power of Music is a new exhibition in Britain at the Science and Industry Museum in the northern city of Manchester. It explores how music has a hold over our daily lives and the science behind that. James Kumarasamy has been for a sneak peek.
In this part of the exhibition, we turn our attention inwards. I'm Dr. Emily Scott Deering. I'm the guest curator of the exhibition. It's reflective and personal, and it's about the way the music affects us, affects our bodies and our minds when we listen to it.
So here we are in a shop. What shop till you drop? Tell us about the shopping experience and how music influences us.
So when you're shopping in the supermarket, often there's music playing in the background. It's surprising the degree to which the music, the pace that it's played at, the type of music that's playing can all affect our shopping experiences, can influence what we buy. And there's even extraordinary research that reveals that we have quite strong associations between what we hear in musical terms and tastes that we perceive. This is a really interesting piece of research that revealed that if there is very stereotypical French music or very stereotypically German music playing in a supermarket aisle, even if you don't notice that there's any music playing at all, you will be strongly influenced by the country of origin of the music. So lots of French music. Oh, I haven't noticed that it's influencing me, but off I go with my nice bottle of French Plonk.
There's a phone here, a flashing light on the phone.
Yeah, should we take the call? It's going to leave us in that really frustrating on hold mode that we all love to hate. This is some more really interesting music research that looks at the degree to which the music you're listening to when you're stuck on hold can actually determine how long you're prepared to wait, how patient you feel.
In general, on-hold music needs to be something that attracts people's attention away from the passing of time, so is interesting, a little bit familiar, and generally isn't interrupted.
Press 1. If you'd like to wait to speak to a representative, please stay on the line.
So the messages that pop up will get back to you, no, bad.
That's a really bad idea, because what it does is it gives us a sense of chunks of time. It gives us a sense that maybe we've heard that 5 times, whereas if we have one continuous stream of music, we have a sense of one thing rather than 5 things.
What have we got here? We've got a wheel, we've got a car.
Yeah, why don't you take a seat in the driving seat?
I'll take a seat in the driver's seat.
There is a body of research now building that says, what about the role of music in and how safe we are and how attentive we are when we're driving a car? Apparently, we should be thinking quite carefully about what music we listen to when. So we're inviting our visitors to sit down, have a listen to a couple of tracks that they used in this driving simulator research, and then open the glove box to find out which is the one that would help them be a safer city driver.
And 2 young female artists from the same year, but different tempos.
Yeah, that's right. We've got Bad Guy by Billie Eilish, and we got 7 Rings by Ariana Grande. And I don't know if I could have picked this, but the driving simulator research reveals that 7 Rings by Ariana Grande is going to keep us attentive, careful, noticing what we need to look out for while we're in the city.
Emily Scott Deering ending that report by James Kumarasamy. And staying on the theme of music, the BBC is to give the first live performance of a long-lost work by a man who's been praised as one of the greatest composers of African descent. Nathaniel Dett was born at the end of the 19th century in Ontario, Canada, but ended his days in the United States. Mark Duff reports.
The slow, lyrical strains of Nathaniel Dett's Magnolia Suite Part 2. It's an orchestral version of that piano work that's been rediscovered in a US archive and been described by the man who found it as a throwback to the music of West African slaves. Nathaniel Dett was, by all accounts, a polymath, a composer, poet, pianist, choir leader and writer. He was fascinated by philosophy, religion and everything from ancient Hebrew legends to African chants and Hindu poets. He came to rail against the influence of ragtime, which he said reinforced negative racial stereotypes. But his musical genius was, inspired by the Czech composer Antonín Dvořák, to cross-pollinate the folk tradition of his black African-American roots with the European classical tradition. And the result of that is music like Magnolia Suite Part 2, which will get its world premiere next month with a live broadcast on BBC Radio 3.
The music of Nathaniel Dett, and that was Mark Duff reporting. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be a new edition of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. And you can also find us on Twitter @GlobalNewsPod. This edition was mixed by Daffyd Evans and the producer was Emma Joseph. The editor, as always, is Karen Martin. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, bye-bye.